Does the government not bear any responsibility for what erupted there in Coolock? You said about you don't want to hear about this whataboutery, but do you accept any responsibility for what unfolded there yesterday in relation to the engagement, in relation to how it was handled by the department and the government, and also then Minister O'Gorman? Can I just ask, why are contractors going in to places earmarked for accommodation for asylum seekers in the middle of the night? And what were the efforts made to diffuse the situation with those blockading that particular site? Can you just detail exactly what engagement there was and what efforts were made by the department to diffuse that situation before yesterday?
So, you have a job to ask the question, so my comments aren't in any way directed at you, but I find that line of commentary put forward by some to be quite extraordinary. What we saw last night was absolutely nothing to do with engagement with the local community about migration policy. What we saw last night was lawlessness, criminality and thuggery. And there's one group of people responsible for that, the thugs and the criminals. And anything else that deviates from this, and I'm really getting so sick and tired of this in this country. You know, people turn up outside politicians' homes with balaclavas, and people in public and media discourse call it a protest. What form of community engagement process does anybody in this country think we could have and should have put in place to tell someone not to throw a petrol bomb at a guard, or not to throw a brick, or not to set a digger on fire, or not to injure a security guard who got up yesterday morning, pulled his whole door behind him and went to work? There's really important issues in this country that we need to do better on around community engagement. Absolutely. And Minister O'Gorman will speak to that. There's a huge amount of work going on in community engagement. Minister O'Gorman, Minister O'Brien, I support it fully. Listening to communities, talking with them, talking about resources. But what we saw yesterday in Coolock was no more anything to do with that than the man in the moon. Yeah. And we've got to be really careful on this, because I'm worried about this. And I am worried about the whataboutery. Because I'm worried when we conflate thuggery, lawlessness on the far right with decent people in our democracy asking questions. And I think one of the most encouraging things that happened last night was this, that local people in Coolock called for calm. That local people in Coolock said, this ain't us. That local people in Coolock had to go out and clean up after the thugs. So this is not about Coolock, this is not about communities, and it is not a reflection on the people at Coolock. This is about people that many of you in this room know who they are, the guards know who they are, and they're trying to rip communities apart in this country. And let me tell you this, if they do it, wherever they do it, however often they do it, they will meet the full rigours of the law. And I want to say this, I want to say thank you to the Gardaí. Thank you to the men and women of An Garda Síochána who put themselves in harm's way. So the only group of people responsible for the lawlessness are those who engaged in lawlessness. And finally, what we actually saw yesterday, I think, was a very significant and concerted effort by the men and women of An Garda Síochána and by our court system. So from my memory, 19 arrests, I think the deployment of around 6 parts of the public order unit, a late night sitting of the court, swift action, swift justice, and I think that is important. So yes, I'll debate all day long about migration policy, lots of legitimate debate. Communities have lots of legitimate questions. Government will continue to do more in that space. But that's not what happened in Coolock, what was about in any manner or means.
Thanks, thanks, Taoiseach. Thanks, Aisling. And I absolutely agree with the Taoiseach. There is no excuse for the scenes that we saw, the damage to private property, the damage to public property, and I think the damage to the reputation of people living in Coolock, the vast majority of whom have in no way support the violent scenes that we saw. But I think it is really important that we're clear in terms of the engagement that took place as regards the Crown Paint sites. The community engagement team in my department would have notified TDs, councillors and Dublin City Council in late March that an offer had come in terms of the use of this site for international protection accommodation. In early April, a meeting was convened again with TDs, with councillors and with community reps through the auspices of the Northside Partnership. Subsequent to that, a detailed briefing was circulated in mid-April, setting out at that point what was the plans for the particular use of site and use of the site. And many of you have seen those briefing documents for other sites. Indeed, you might have seen this particular briefing. We would have then had further engagement with the Northside Community Forum, again providing further information. So 4 months ago, the initial information about the planned use of this site was provided, and our community engagement team have been there to speak with TDs, to speak with councillors throughout all that time. And I know quite a few TDs and councillors in the area have been on to the community engagement team. So there has been very detailed information provided on the use of this particular site. As the Taoiseach says, even if there wasn't, still not an excuse to throw a petrol bomb. But very detailed information has been in the public domain for a very considerable period of time. In terms of the I suppose the operational decisions that An Garda Síochána advise our department and advise contractors who our department are working with. They are ultimately a call that the Gardaí make in terms of when is the best time to access a particular site, and it varies in place to place. On Garda Síochána, I know we're supportive of the machinery and equipment coming onto the site the other night in terms of their direct engagement, asking the protesters to move aside. Obviously, they refused, and that access was secured. But subsequently, as we know, I suppose a call was put out in terms of bringing people and encouraging them to engage in disruptive and violent behaviour. There's no excuse for that, but as I say, very clear information was provided over the last 4 months in terms of the use of the Crown Paid site.
Okay,
just
Gavin there.
Just very briefly add to that, if I may, because that site is 3-4 miles away from where I live and where I grew up. I know most of the community, many people in the community there. I want to fully support what the Taoiseach and Minister O'Gorman have said. There's no excuse for what happened yesterday. It was reprehensible, thuggish, criminal behaviour. And Gardaí and security personnel's lives were put on the line. We saw criminal damage, firebomb or petrol bombs being used, fencing, blocking off public roadways. We saw the actions of a few, very, very few, disrupting the many. And it cannot be allowed to happen. And they cannot be excused in any way, shape or form, because I know from talking to friends in Coolock and in Darragh in that area, they're absolutely disgusted. There is no support from the local community for what happened there yesterday. None whatsoever. And it should be roundly condemned, and no excuses whatsoever should be put forward to in any way, shape or form try to condone or excuse even elements of that. Because we could see over the last number of weeks, that whole site was barricaded, effectively barricaded for weeks. And the guards, in their approach yesterday and what I saw, carried out their duties with incredible restraint. And I personally want to thank them for what they did yesterday as well, and putting their lives on the line. It cannot be excused and should be roundly condemned by everyone.
Okay, Gavin. Thank you, Minister.
Thanks. Can I ask the Taoiseach and the Minister for